Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so honored to be here with my colleagues, Dr. Fritz Galette and Joy Stevens. And today we want to talk a little bit about safe space groups. And I got to tell you, I've been working on diversity and inclusion programming for the past couple of years, but I still have trouble articulating, what is a safe space and why do we create these safe spaces for people to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And Fritz, I know you host and facilitate a lot of these dialogue groups. And can you just give us your thoughts and shed some light on that safe space description?
Sure. Well, I got into doing the dialogues groups because as a psychologist, my goal working with individuals and groups and families is to create a space within which people can have a dialogue, a healthy dialogue, and a goal in setting up that space is to make it safe. And so when things started to really start to heat up last year, and we all got busy with doing D&I work, I started getting the call because companies were recognizing we need a space to have a safe space, a safe dialogue. And I think that's how we started using the term. But for me, the term safe space is an aspiration. It's a goal. It's not, we can assume it's there at the beginning, but many people know that someone can invite you into a space, tell you it's safe, and it really isn't because our fear usually is what you say can and will be held against you. Well, when I'm constructing these groups, I describe it and define it as a space within which we're going to work together to collaborate, to create a culture of a dialogue. And our goal is for it to be safe. And there are some rules around that, and we'll get into that later. But that's where I'm coming from. And that's where I define and describe what these facilitated dialogue groups are about.
Great. Thank you so much, Fritz. And Joy, you do so many different things of engaging people in dialogue around diversity, equity, inclusion, and facilitating these workshops on bias, implicit bias, microaggression, historical racism, and white supremacy. So when you hear safe space in a lot of the content you deliver, how do you connect to it?
It's so interesting. And I'm so glad we're having this conversation because when Fritz is talking about, a safe space and the fact that, just because you say that doesn't necessarily make it the safe space. When I first heard that phrase, it had to have been maybe between 5 and 8 years ago. And it was in the form of, at the time, people were categorizing millennials and Gen Z as needing a safe space. And they were using that phrase like it was a place that they could go, that they created, where they could be themselves. Their living room might be a safe space. Their friend's house, a particular bar, etc., might be a safe space. You could argue that until the protest, Stonewall Bar was a safe space for people in the LGBTQ community. They could go there, they could be themselves. They didn't have to worry about conforming to other people's expectations, etc. I could just be me, But as we've used that phrase to mean something bigger, it became almost like a judgment-free zone. Because the minute you start bringing other people into a space that you consider safe, you've got to make, to Fritz's point, you have to put energy into making sure it maintains that safety. If I'm doing just fine in my cocoon of blankets on my couch and I feel safe, and somebody knocks on the door, now I've got to figure out how do I maintain this with a new entity in the room. So if you're talking any sort of corporate setting, anywhere where you have people who don't all see eye to eye, or maybe have differing viewpoints, you have to create the vehicle by which they make it safe. It's not safe just because they came in and said it was.
Right. Yeah, those are great points. And it really makes me think about, well, what happens when it's unsafe? And Fritz, what I'd like for you to address is, when we invite people to share their opinions, their beliefs, their values, their thoughts, and one person's values and opinions might be offensive to someone else. So when that does happen in these safe space dialogue groups, what do you do to get not necessarily get control, but prevent it from spiraling into an antagonistic exchange?
But one of the things I define before we begin, and we don't just jump into it. We don't go, okay, I said it wasn't a safe space, but let's start and let's start. It's like, no, I have to start by honoring what it is. So if it's a group of people that have never met before, we're going to do the usual things that we would do in a social event. We try to introduce people to one another and give people a chance to just unmute, because we're doing this all online, and begin to speak. And I usually am addressing the reason that I'm doing this. I tell a little bit about myself. I tell a bit about my experience in doing it. And then I'm often starting with a story that could be a little bit vulnerable. I might share an anecdote about myself, an experience that I've had that relates to why we're here today. But I also give people a framework, and anybody who's been in any group process, any process where they talk about communication, I start by defining the differences between a conversation, a dialogue, let's say a debate, a verbal fight, and a dialogue. And it's dialogue where I spend time talking about how in a dialogue, what we're doing is all coming to the table and putting out on the table something that we're sharing. And that in a dialogue, my goal is not for my point to supersede yours. In a dialogue, my goal is just to be allowed to have that space to put something out there. And so I might teach people some basic 101 communication responses, how to listen. When you're listening to someone, you're not preparing what you're going to say. You're listening and you're trying to take it in. And then the first thing you say, before you tell them what your point is you might have to reflect back what that person has said. And we really can spend not only 90 minutes doing that, we could spend a day just teaching people how to go, so what I heard you say is, and did I get that right? No, I didn't. Can you clarify? I mean, anybody who's done conflict resolution or been in couples work and relationship work, you've therapists do this all the time, is we're teaching people how to actually engage in a dialogue, and that's hard stuff.
Yeah, and so Jordan, do you use similar strategies, or do you handle it in a different way when in the course of your workshops or discussion groups, when there is active dialogue and maybe disagreement? How do you assert yourself in those types of conversations?
I do a lot similar. Like when Fritz said listening, I was like, yes, listen, because more often than not, we are waiting on our chance to refute what we're hearing. Or even if we agree with, we're waiting on our chance to testify. Yeah, me too. And you wait for a millisecond of a pause to jump in, and maybe not even realizing what's happened before. And you cannot digest what someone is saying to you if if half of your energy is spent waiting for the pause so you can talk. You're only half listening. There's levels to listening, and to really experience or participate in deep listening, you have to sit with what you're hearing. You have to digest it. You have to see it as valid. And that's a lot of part of it, especially when we're talking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. A lot of people share their experiences. And if you really want to understand that lived experience, that point of view, you have to listen, not to debate, not to throw out, a different point of view. There'll be time for that. You'll have your turn. But to really understand why they think that, where they're coming from, what in their background led them to that point, and how does that relate to your lived experiences? If it does, then you can commiserate to some extent. If it doesn't, now we can have a conversation about understanding where I'm coming from, and then I can understand where you're coming from, and then we can try to find those commonalities, because yelling at each other doesn't get us anywhere. Yelling at each other, or just taking calculated shots at each other, just further polarizes everyone. Nobody's listening. Everybody thinks they're right and the other person is absolutely wrong, and we don't get any further. So yeah, if you don't listen, then everything else falls apart.
So yeah, if I can interrupt there, but actually to demonstrate. So Joy, what I hear you saying is that listening is really at the crux of all of this. If you can get people to slow down and just take in what's being said, and allow it to, process, maybe wash over you, resonate within you, you can work toward more deeply connecting to what that person is talking about,
Absolutely.
where they're coming from.
And as Joy said, there are levels of listening, and in the coactive coaching discipline, there's 3 levels of listening. And just briefly, the first level is the listener saying, "What's in it for me? What's this person going to say that how I could benefit?" And the second level is really focusing on what the speaker is saying and getting an understanding of what they're trying to communicate. And the third level, also global listening, is not only listening to the words, but observing the body language, the tone, the emotion. Are they nervous? Are they anxious? And using all those signals and communications to get a better understanding of what someone's expressing. There's an expression: most people listen with the intent to reply. Try and listen with thoughtful reflection. And I think that's very difficult for a lot of people to do. It requires great patience and an ability to slow down. And in our world, communicating on devices and wanting instant response, listening is a skill that needs to be developed and practiced.
And as I'm listening to you, Dave, I'm allowing what you're saying to go into my mind, go into my body. I'm really allowing myself to process it. And I'm remembering your question from earlier: what happens when somebody is doing and saying something that is offensive and I'm facilitating the group? And if I've set the stage right, and if I've played some of the ground rules and I've been demonstrating it already, I might say, first thing I might say is what I just said to Joy. So what I hear you saying is, and what I'm looking for, and what I'm trying to teach groups to do, individuals to do with one another, is you might be upset with the thing you heard content-wise at the headline. But if you actually sit with the person long enough to go, tell me more about what you really, really mean, you go deeper into their motivations, into their thoughts, you find out we're not as different as we sounded. We might have said, I voted for this person, but I don't get into those political conversations. I go, you voted for this person. Tell me what that was like for you. Tell me about your background, your experience, how it made you feel. Boom, 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 boom. And all of a sudden they're telling me stories about their background and their life. And I have a background and I have a life too. So we're still human. Our hearts are still beating. And quite often that diffuses this top choice here, which is the first thing they started with.
Yeah, and that's amazing stuff. And I love meeting new people. I love hearing life stories and experiences from people, but not everybody does. And certainly a lot of what we do is in the workplace and building, helping people cultivate and nurture relationships and build effective teams. But Joy, what if you're dealing with people who just want to do their work and go home, and they're really not interested in learning about their colleagues? What can we do, or what can an organization do to create more engagement where, as Fritz says, foster greater understanding?
It's interesting, that idea that somebody wants to just do the work and go home. I would ask why. You spend so much time. Before we were all, in these little boxes on Zoom, we spent so much time at work, from potentially 7:30 in the morning to 7:30 at night. Half your day, more than half of your waking hours with these people that you don't want to know. You don't want to get to know. You don't want to interact with. Why not? And I'm not saying that you have to go and, have a potluck dinner at work every day, but what is driving your resistance to sharing yourself with the people around you? Sometimes it could be a perceived difference of opinion, because that difference might not actually exist if you listen to other people. Or sometimes it can be a previous bad experience. Everybody has baggage that they bring with them. They bring their entire lived life with them into every room they go into. And sometimes when they survey the room, they may decide, I don't want to be here, or I don't want to share, or it's not safe for me to really talk about myself. So I'm just going to do my job, keep my head down, and go home. And that's something that companies could really examine. If you really want to have better engagement, understand why people don't want to be engaged in the first place.
Yeah, maybe a particular individual just in their own mind, they don't feel welcomed into a team or a department within an organization. And just the I guess it's sort of a self-defense mode of walling everybody else off and just not finding out for sure.
And I think if we get curious, because I really tap into my curiosity, especially if someone says, well, it's not safe, I have nothing to talk about. I might actually acknowledge that, I'm hearing you. It isn't safe, actually. And I'm wondering, maybe you can brainstorm with me to help it make safe, or is there something we can do? I mean, already the more I talk, the more I'm actually honoring the share that they did have. When someone says, I don't want to talk, guess what they just did? They just talked. Now they can do it verbally, they can do it non-verbally. But if we treat every offering as an offering to be respected and be curious about it and follow through on it, we can easily go deeper.
Mhm.
And that's what often happens in those dialogue groups. If I started with the definitions and the framework, and then would anybody be willing to unmute? After I've already unmuted and outed myself and talked about something with my experience, I've already demonstrated like that first step.